afternoon, but Jake's planning to be here, I think, in a few minutes. Is the plan. Sarah had to work. I think somebody had to call out today, so she got called in today. Looks like she's not here. Not heard from anybody else specifically. Before we begin, Lee, would you mind leading some word of prayer?
Let's pray. Our Father who art in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for this new day. We thank you for the opportunity to come here to worship you. Help us, Father, that we will glorify your name, to honor and praise you as we ought. As we are so thankful for all the many blessings that you have given to us. We thank you for this creation, for the beauty that you have made for us to enjoy. We thank you for, most importantly, for your Son, our Savior, Jesus the Christ, for the opportunity and ability that we each have now to be able to be reunited with you, having sinned and fallen short. But the way has been provided that we can once again be back in a right relationship with you. Help us, Father, to realize how destitute and poor and absolutely nothing we are without you. Help us to strive to be careful in our life, to put you first, be careful to do your will, to study, to strive to be closer to you. Help us as we go through this Bible class this afternoon. Help us that we may do exactly that, that we will open your word, that we will learn how we should be as Christians, how we should be lights in this community. Help us to prepare ourselves as we plan to spread the gospel here in this place. Help us that we may look for those opportunities to teach those around us, those that we work with, that we associate with, go to school with. Help us that we may be able to find opportunities to teach others about your Son, our Savior. Please be with Chad as he presents and guides us through the study here this afternoon. We ask that you be with those that are unable to be here as well. We ask that you help them that they may be able to be here in the next appointed time. We ask that you be with those that are sick and struggling with their health, that you restore them to the full measure of health, if it be your will. We love you, Lord, and we thank you for all your great blessings. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, so obviously we're talking about personal evangelism, and the aspect I would like to talk about today is having a desire to do the work. And we're going to kind of break it apart in kind of two different aspects. One would be a love for God, and one would be a love for the lost. But I want to start here in Nehemiah chapter 4, which seems the obvious place, as you remember, Israel's return and rebuilding of Jerusalem. I mean, why not talk about personal evangelism from Nehemiah chapter 4? The answer is because in verse 6. So you have the building of the wall that happens in two different stages. By the end of chapter 6, the whole wall is finished within, 52 days. The whole wall is finished. So you have two sections. They build up to half the wall. There is some conspiracies that happen in oppression that happens in chapter 5 and chapter 6, and then 52 days later the entire wall is finished. But in verse 6 of chapter 4, we built the wall, and the wall was joined together to half of its height, for the people had a mind to work. One of the remarkable things here in Nehemiah is, how do you build an entire city wall in 52 days? I mean, it's an unheard of feat. You know, you think of not just a wall, but how big were the walls in Jerusalem?
Very, very thick.
Yeah, they're thick, they're tall.
Thick, yeah.
I mean, you're dealing with, how do you just manhandle all the material into place, let alone, everything else. And part of that equation in chapter 4 and verse 6 is they had a mind to work. How is it that we undertake the work here in Williamsburg. It's a huge challenge. There's a lot of people to reach. There's a lot of opposition that we're going to face, much like they did here in Nehemiah. How do we work through that? And part of that has to be having a mind to work, having the desire to do the work. You know, how much harder is it to do stuff that you aren't interested in, that you're not zealous about? How hard is it to get your kids to do stuff that they're not interested, that they're not zealous about? Considerably harder. And that's what we want to talk about today, briefly. I don't have a ton of stuff we're going to look at. We're just going to look at a few different passages and kind of talk about the principles and the ideas behind that. And we're going to look at Matthew chapter 9. I want to look at specifically two passages that deal with Jesus' mindsets here in Matthew and in Luke. If someone would, let's look at Matthew chapter 9 towards the end of the book, or into the chapter rather, verses 35 through verse 38, if someone would mind.
Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is truly plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send laborers into his harvest."
Thank you, John. And so it mentions that he's moving from village to village, or from city to village, and that he is preaching the gospel, he's going into synagogues, he's healing diseases, and then Matthew pauses in that narration of his travel in verse 36 to talk about his mindset. What was one of his motivations for doing this?
Compassion.
Yeah, compassion. Why is that significant to mention here in Matthew chapter 9 and recounting what Jesus did?
This is probably not what you're thinking about, Chad. I guess it's a broad question. But Jesus had compassion, and he was moved for the people he saw. He was healing their sicknesses, but his compassion was driven because they were lost.
How many times do we see people who are lost, like sheep without a shepherd, and have little to no compassion for them? We're busy about our day's work, we're doing all of the normal stuff for our normal schedule, and the fact that they're lost, the fact that they are like sheep without a shepherd, just passes right past us, and we don't take the time to consider that and use that as a motivation to do what we ought to do. And I think that's important. There is an old phrase I think is worth considering. People want to know how much you care before they want to know how much you know. I think it's, for some reason, like bedside manners for doctors, that phrase is linked to my mind. Whether or not that's where it originated from, I don't know. But isn't that to some degree true? Yeah. There are sometimes we look towards individuals just for sheer knowledge, but when it comes to personal one-on-one work, we tend to gravitate towards people who show compassion and caring and kindness and a little bit of long-suffering on our behalf. We tend to grow closer towards those who have a genuine interest in us as individuals. Part of that's going to be the same. How many people, we're not going to name names, so no naming names, how many people do we know in our past or in our lives who are happy to go up and tell people that they're wrong about any matter of doctrine, but still have no compassion or caring in their heart for the individual? I'm happy to debate and argue and prove that you're wrong and I'm right, and I'm smart and you're less smart. But how many times do we truly care about the person themselves? Obviously here in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus was right about everything. He was definitely going to be more and better equipped to debate and discuss and teach, which he was doing, but he still also had the compassion for the people.
Isn't that part of the problems with the Pharisees and the Sadducees? You know, these scribes and these elders, these people that really should have really had that compassion and care and desire to teach those that, you know, did not know the law, maybe couldn't understand it, maybe couldn't read, you know, I mean, but yet, how did they come across? And we know how they came across, much like sometimes we easily, if we were truly to evaluate ourselves, much like sometimes we might come across as, I kind of know it already, but doesn't do anything if we're not truly compassionate about those that are lost.
Chad,
Mhm.
I was thinking that I've never really had this thought before. I think it makes sense in my mind. If Jesus fed the multitudes, he healed the multitudes. Let's think back to Mac talking about works out of James chapter 2, where it was said that for those who were hungry or those who were cold, and you offer them no food or you offer them no blanket. So then maybe I see someone that's hungry and I do offer them food. But Jesus went even further than to just offer food to the hungry and blanket to the cold or healing to the sick. His compassion went even further than what James is talking about. And I think of what you read in Nehemiah 4. They had a mind to work. My mind to work, is my mind to work limited to feeding the hungry and helping the unfortunate with temporal things or things of this world, or do I have compassion even further as Jesus did?
That's a good point. Very good point. I had not planned on looking at Matthew 23 since Lee brought it up. I'll blame him. Matthew 23 deals with the woes of the scribes and the Pharisees. Verses 13 down to verse 15 are two of the woes. The first woe in verse 13 is that the scribes and the Pharisees are hypocrites, that they shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for they neither enter themselves nor allow those who would enter. I was thinking of a different one. Sorry, I was thinking of verse 15. But where's one he mentions that they bind heavy burdens on them and will not lift a finger? I told you I hadn't planned on looking at these verses. So.
4?
Verse 4? Yes. That they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear, lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. So, and then he goes on to say that they do all their deeds to be seen by others. And then here in verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across land and sea to make a single proselyte. And then when they have become a proselyte, you make them twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. So in the realm of proselytizing, of teaching, of personal evangelism, there is a pretty good history of the Pharisees doing that. Whenever you think about what's happening when Jesus is baptized or baptizing, that process that they see John on the other side of the river, this was a common practice of baptizing to proselytize, to make a disciple of. This is not an uncommon occurrence at the beginning or the openings of the gospel. The Pharisees were going out and they were doing their work. Ish. They'd travel across land and sea to go find a single person, which that seems very commendable. But in the process, here in verse 4, it doesn't seem like they care a whole lot about people themselves, where they bind heavy burdens and they lay it on them, and then they don't care to help them at all. And that in the end here in verse 5, what they're doing to be seen by other people. And don't know how much I want to step on everybody's toes, but there's a real sense of feeling proud about going and doing work of whatever it is. It's the same idea, let's take pictures while we hand out food to the poor. That happens sometimes even in spreading of the gospel, where we can self-promote, I'm going here to do this, and it's the exact same idea of I'm doing this to be seen by other people. that there would be some recognition either amongst our group or amongst other Christians that we are people who are energetic and we are going out and we are working and we forget about those whom we are to have compassion on, those whom we are to serve, those whom we are trying to find. And so, looking at Matthew 23, there's a lot of the negative examples. We can do the work and still do it wrongly. But not doing the work is still doing it wrongly as well. So sometimes you look at Matthew 23 and think, I better just not do it wrongly and not do it at all. That's not at all Jesus' point. Is that we are do it not, to bear the burdens with them in verse 4, that we are not to be seen by other people, or not to do it to be seen by other people in verse 5. And then while we should be willing to go and to do in verse 15, obviously the job is not to just make them our disciples, but to make them disciples of God. Nick?
I don't think keep knocking on some of these Jews here, but just having the opportunity to be over there a few times and seeing that nothing's changed. I mean, it's very much like the time of Jesus when you go to the Wailing Wall. The closer you can get to where the temple was is the holier place. So there's a whole dugout kind of area, and that's where all the we'll call them Pharisees. I don't know what. A higher level. We kind of joked, all the different hats and things that we would see. All the different kind of sects or groups of these people, but it just seemed like it was a show to be seen still. The phylacteries, the wraps on the arm, like everything in the pomp and the circumstance, and you didn't wander in there. You would not wander in there, and if you tried, you'd be removed very quickly. But that area that was closest to God, that they still hold, is really a lot of show and a lot of pomp and a lot of circumstance, much like in a Catholic or church or something like that. A lot of pomp and circumstance and flowery things, and that's missing the point, which is what Jesus is so aggressively, especially against those that would make that sign. And I think what John was saying earlier is even sometimes we think, well, we would never be like that, and then we would do something to be seen in a way, where we're helping somebody out, instead of really like Jesus' example, where he just constantly cared about and prayed about those that were lost.
John?
We had a similar discussion. I remember we talked about evangelism a few years ago, about letting the things that you do be known. And obviously, if you're letting the things that you do be known for the sake of boasting in yourself, then that's wrong. But outside of Christ, I think probably for all of us, the greatest example of a Christian was probably Paul. And we're comforted and we're encouraged by how Paul conducted himself. And he says in Philippians 3:17, "Brethren, join in following my example and note those who so walk as you have us as a pattern." If Lee tells me, John, I was out at Food Line the other day and I was talking to people, I'm probably not going to think, well, listen to Lee brag on himself. I don't know that I'm different, but I kind of want to know those things because it can be a motivator, it can be an encourager. I understand the principle of boasting about yourself amongst others, but there's also a need to maybe, I guess, talk about things sometimes as well. Kind of think of the best way to word that as a source of encouragement and helping others along the way in what they do. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if Paul is my example, but I never knew what Paul did, or I never knew what Paul said, and I never knew really anything about Paul, he's probably not going to be an example, but he's an example in his conduct. And granted, we're not Paul. But if I see Chad or Mac or Laura or someone, or I talk to them about the things that they're doing, I see that as a benefit for me, because I'm not going to think that anybody's being boastful in this room of what they're doing. So amongst ourselves, maybe, I don't probably need to tell everybody in the world that I'm standing out in front of Food Line trying to talk to people, but maybe if I tell Tamika, or maybe if Tamika tells me, and we talk about those things, and I don't think that we'll receive that as boastfulness and a braggadocious attitude in trying to make those things known, if that makes any sense.
Let's think about Paul whenever he returned from his travels. He's trying to find a passage for it, and it's not in his mind. He would always travel back to Jerusalem. And the wording, I'm trying to find the exact wording, is that they gave a report to the church of what the Holy Spirit did. I'm trying to remember exactly where that's mentioned. If anybody can remember that exact spot. 14:27, when they arrived, they gathered the church together, declared all that God had done with them, and how he had opened doors of faith to the Gentiles, and there remained no little time with the disciples. That seems to be kind of a common occurrence here in the book of Acts, is that when Paul returns, he would go to Jerusalem, recount not so much of what he did, even though that was obviously a part of it. He recounted what God had done. And I think that seems to be kind of a fundamental difference between those things. You know, it's not like this is all that we had done. Obviously, Paul is telling them what he experienced, what he put his hands to do the work. But all the glory, all the credit, all the accolades belong to God. And it appears that Paul and Barnabas did a really good job of making that the case.
I think 1 Corinthians 3 makes that point, Chad. And that if Lee's out in front of Food Line and someone becomes curious and comes in, it wasn't Lee that did that, it was God that did that, but it was Lee that was the tool to bring that, so I hope nobody misunderstood what I was saying. It's not me that's doing it, but it is encouraging to me to hear that someone's doing that, and it can be a motivator, I guess.
Yeah.
15 in verse 4 is also Acts 15:4. The apostles and elders, and they reported all the things that God had done with them. Continuation of where you just read.
Well, the verse before that too, Lee, where he talks about them going through Samaria and telling all, describing the conversion of the Gentiles. So.
And the result is it caused great joy among the brethren. Back to the point I think John was getting at, that joy that can be found when we get to hear of the good things that are happening.
I guess I was making that point more so because, I mean, I've talked with people before who think, do not say anything, you know, the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, or what, mentioning of nothing along those lines, and I understand that, but there's some benefit to wisely talking about those things as well.
Yeah, and I think that's accurate. My point was from Acts 14 to 15 is that the mannerism in which we describe that. You know, I think we're 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we can describe ourselves as planting or ourselves as watering, but also need to mention absolutely that it is God who gives the increase, and what God does in that case. When Paul writes to Timothy at the end of 1 Timothy chapter 5, he mentions that the sin of some people are conspicuous, and going before them the judgment, but the sins of others appear later. So also good works are conspicuous, and even those that are not cannot remain hidden. And I think the idea of what he's getting at there is not that we go out and we speak about all that we do, but our deeds are still going to be known to some point in time. They're going to be recognized. That I think as we looked at in Proverbs, that the need to toot our own horn should not exist for us. It's going to be known, and we don't need to be the people who necessarily mention it. If we are going to mention what's happening, we should mention fully and completely that it's God who gives that increase. And it's God who really truly works. Let's look at Luke chapter 19. Kind of on the same thought. where of how God chose to send Jesus into the world. The choice could have been to be born in Caesar's house. It could have been chosen to be born wealthy, already in a place of prominence or position. You think of, if you want to change the world, get a message out, be someone who invents the printing press, who starts, sending out leaflets, not waiting for Gutenberg. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on of what could have been done, but he was born in a manger to an unwed mother, betrothed mother, to a carpenter who then fled into Egypt. It was not a respectable place. And then in verse 10 of Luke 19, he says that for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. If it was glory or honor or recognition or fame, I think he would have come into the world through a different mannerism. But he came to seek and save the lost. And so we think about becoming like Jesus and adopting his mindset and following in his footsteps. That should be a mindset that we consider for ourselves as well. And that we are going to be here to seek and save the lost. On a very similar fashion, back in Matthew chapter 5, I know that I wasn't here on Wednesday, I'm not sure how far you guys got it in Matthew chapter 5, but verse 14, you are the light of the world, a city that has set in a hill that cannot be hidden. Our mannerisms, our way of life, should be beacons for those who are lost and floundering, those who are seeking shelter, those who are looking to get out of the storm. We should be noticeable to those around us as being followers of God. Our mindset, I believe, should be in line with Jesus in Luke 19, that we are here to seek and save the lost. And our mannerisms of life should indicate to people that is exactly what we're trying to do.
I was thinking about this, so what do we know of Jesus? Nothing. Only what he said. You don't know whether he's tall, short, what he looked like, what he had, nothing about Jesus. It's what Jesus said, which was only the will of the Father, and only did the will of the Father. But I guess that makes me realize even more why having icons and things are not a good idea. Are we looking at Jesus as the man? No, we shouldn't be looking at Jesus as a man. We're looking at Jesus as our Savior and the message. And so that's what we're studying. We're studying his words that he spoke. Same thing with all the apostles. What do you know about them? Not much, very little about all these Christians in the first century that spread the gospel, that went everywhere preaching and teaching. And that's the point. There's no need to know anything really about them. What we know about them is the words, the message that they taught. I think that's pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm. Look over at John chapter 21 real quick. Someone had pointed out something interesting, not John chapter 21, going over to Acts chapter 9. We're going to look at John chapter 21 though. I'll just reference Acts chapter 9. That when Jesus appeared to Saul on the road to Damascus, he didn't say, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting my people? And that's never clicked with me. He says, why are you persecuting me? Where Jesus tells you, if you have given food to the hungry, clothes to the naked, visit those who are in prison, you have done it to him. He describes people persecuting the church as persecuting him personally. So, relaying that into John chapter 21, you have this exchange, verses 15 down to verse 19, between John and Peter, or Jesus and Peter, where Jesus asked 3 times, do you love me more than these? Do you love me? I don't think the indication is, do you love me more than the other apostles? I think the indication is, do you love me more than these fish? Interesting. Anyway, back to where we were. Time back in. So we're going to be getting into John chapter 21. Jesus says, if you love me, then what is the natural reaction here 3 times in these verses. Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." What is Jesus' response?
Feed or tend my sheep.
So feed my sheep, feed my lambs, tend my sheep. 3 different phrasings for the exact same idea. If you love me, then get to work. And so we talked about the idea of breaking this up into kind of two mindsets. One is loving God enough to do the work, and the second one is loving the people enough to do the work. And to some degree here in John chapter 21, Jesus is combining both of those ideas together. That if you are really going to love him, you're going to then love the people that he loves enough to do the work. And I think that's a strong passage here in John chapter 21 for the work of the gospel, for doing the personal work between individuals. If I'm going to claim that I love him, I also have to work in his vineyard. It's very, very similar to 1 John chapter 4, where John makes the point that you can't love God whom you've never seen, and hate your brother whom you do see. There's similar concepts there. I'm going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So the topic comes up in chapter 8 and chapter 9 over matters of opinion, matters of conscience, areas of liberty, whatever you want to phrase it. So either eating of meats, as he gets into chapter 9, taking along a believing wife, and basically taking a paycheck. And as you get towards the very end of chapter 10, whatever you eat, whatever you drink, whatever you do, in verse 31. But Paul makes this point in verse 19, though I am free from all. And that's, I want us to plug in our American mindset into verse 19. If there's anything we don't want people to take, probably our guns. I don't know how you guys feel about guns. I'm just kidding, I don't know how we feel about guns. But secondly, whatever we don't want people to take is our liberties, whatever liberties they happen to be. And Paul puts himself in that kind of mindset. Though I'm free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I may win more of them. To the Jews I become a Jew in order that I may win the Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, while not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I may save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Paul's desire for them, for the lost, for the brethren at Corinth, was greater than his desire for his personal liberties, his personal bounty in those things. And sometimes when it comes to just the internal struggles of brethren in a particular area, we have a hard time with the idea of giving up of certain liberties or certain rights or certain freedoms in order to make peace, in order to show love, because that's my liberty, that's my freedom. Why would your conscience tread on my freedoms? Paul says why. That by all means we may save some. What would it be like to be free from all the Jewish restrictions and then put yourself back under all of the Jewish restrictions for a long time in order to reach the Jews? What would it be like to live like a Gentile after being under Jewish customs all your life in order to win the Gentiles? All of that would be strange, unusual, uncomfortable. It would be giving up a lot. And that mindset here in both in verse 22 and 23, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I may win some, or save some, and that I do all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. And so as we look back at Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6, the people had a mind to work. I think it's pretty evident here that Paul had a mind to work. It's not for his own personal glorification, as we looked for the Pharisees in Matthew 23. It wasn't to bind up burdens and just watch people suffer under the new restrictions under Christ, but it was that he was willing to go above and beyond in order to save some. Any thoughts on Paul's mindset here? It's a pretty remarkable mindset. That he viewed his life for the purpose of saving other people. Let's look at Acts chapter 8 for a moment. So I've heard two different ideas on the Great Commission, and I'll share both of them with you for whatever they're worth. So Matthew 28, 18, is it 28, 28 or 28, 18? I know it goes like hand in hand, but I can't remember this one. 28:18. All authority has been given me in heaven and earth. Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. There is, obviously in English, the command is a declarative go and do. I don't know Greek very well. By very well, I mean, I don't know Greek. We'll just go ahead and say it that way. Those who do know Greek better than me, or some of those who know Greek better than me, make the point from Matthew 28 that it's not a command to go and to teach, but wherever you go to teach. So the question comes up, is the command for all of us to all go everywhere in all of creation teaching the gospel? Or is the command for wherever you happen to go, you make disciples? So whether you go to Gloucester, or you go to Newport News, or you go to Vicksburg, or you go to Arkansas, wherever you happen to go, you teach. So I think that there's merit to both of those. For the declarative go, I think was an obvious statement to the apostles, and they obviously did go and teach. But in Acts chapter 8, you have the other side of the coin, where you have people who are not apostles, who are not commissioned directly by Jesus to go and to teach. But you have individuals who, in verse 4, after the persecutions arise, they're scattered to the four winds. Wherever they happen to be, they continue to teach. That even though they were being persecuted for what they believed, even though they had to leave jobs and homes and families in order to be safe for being a Christian, they still taught the gospel anywhere and everywhere. And so while most of us will probably never feel the compelling urge, to move, to Mexico to go and preach the gospel there, that may not be what individually we're called to do, but wherever you happen to be, to do that, whether it's in Jerusalem, or take out Jerusalem, whether it's here in Virginia or some other place. There's this urgency that wherever you go, that you preach the word. But getting back to the mindset, I kind of skipped over a couple passages I had laid out before. I want to look at just two quick passages in 1 Thessalonians. Paul is probably his most tender, most doting whenever he writes the Thessalonians. They seem to be in a fairly precarious position that, as Paul is traveling through, he is unable to travel to Asia Minor. He passes right on through to Pamphylia, where he gets the Macedonian call. I probably get the name of that city wrong. We'll take a pass on that one. And then he travels over to Macedonia, and he gets to reason for 3 Sabbath days with the church, or with the people there at Thessalonica, and a great number of them become Christians. But imagine just how much work can be done in just 3 weeks. And so Paul writes them a letter, he sends them Timothy, he makes the point that there was nobody else who cared for them in the same way that Timothy has cared for them, so he sends Timothy along to find out how they're doing. And he writes them a letter, and he's probably the most tender that he is in any of his letters, writing to these brand new babes in Christ. In chapter 1 and verse 2, he makes the point that we could give thanks to God always for all of you, constantly mentioning you in all of our prayers. And the idea of just here is somebody who is constantly praying for, lavishing this love on them. Over in chapter 2 and in verse 11, he mentions that you know how, like a father with his children, we exhort each one of you and encourage you and charge you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. So we talked about the love of the brethren. Paul, I think, demonstrates that here to the Thessalonians. He describes in a variety of ways through 1 Thessalonians, and just we prayed for you, we were like a father to you, he calls them brothers innumerable times throughout the letter, constantly reminding them of the love and the care that he has for them. And so there needs to be, I believe, a deep and abiding love for the lost. To have the same eyes that Jesus had, who looks out and has compassion on them who are like sheep without a shepherd. I think that there also needs to be a deep and abiding love for God, who then commands us, if you love me, tend my sheep, feed my flocks. That whether we view Matthew 28:18 as a direct command for you to go and you to teach, or as a command of wherever you go teaching. I think that needs to be a huge part of it. So we're going to end where we had started in Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6, that we need to be people who have a mind to work. A lot can be done whenever we have a mind to work. Or a lot more can be done when we have a mind to work. And a lot can be done. So next week, I have not expressly picked out the next topic. It is going to be on personal evangelism. Hint, hint, wink, wink. I haven't figured out quite the angle we're going to get to, but we will think of that, and we'll get back to this next week. I think next week John's going to be out of town, and I think Jake's going to be out of town. Okay. So we will have an abbreviated group of men with an abundance of wonderful, wonderful men. So expect everyone to pitch in for our class next week, and we'll pick up there next week.